The judge set her glasses down and looked across the courtroom at my son-in-law. Not at his lawyer. At him directly. Mr. Dalton, are you telling this court that your father-in-law, a man who holds 3 engineering patents, managed 2 income properties for 15 years, and successfully handled his own medical decisions after his stroke, is now suddenly incompetent to manage his own finances? Derek shifted in his seat. His lawyer put a hand on his arm, but Derek shrugged it off. Your Honor, his judgment has been impaired since the stroke. We're concerned he's making decisions that could devastate the family's financial future. The judge picked up a document from the stack in front of her. This report, submitted by Dr. Harmon, suggests moderate cognitive decline. However, I also have a report here from Dr. Patricia Wells at Maricopa Medical Center, who examined Mr. Calloway 12 days ago and found no evidence of cognitive impairment whatsoever. She looked up. Mr. Sutton, would you like to explain how 2 doctors who examined the same patient 2 weeks apart reached such dramatically different conclusions? Derek's lawyer stood. Your Honor, Dr. Wells's examination was arranged by the respondent's own legal counsel, which raises questions about... It raises no questions at all, Counselor. What raises questions is a medical report submitted to this court from a physician who, according to our records, has never once billed Mr. Calloway's insurance for an appointment, which suggests he never actually examined him. She let that land. The silence in the courtroom was the kind that makes you remember to breathe. We'll be looking into that. Sit down. I kept my hands folded on the table. My lawyer, a quiet, precise woman named Beverly Torres, touched my wrist briefly and nodded once. Steady. From across the aisle, I could feel my daughter watching me. Not Derek, Diane. My daughter, who had handed her husband the idea of filing this petition, or had at least handed him enough silence to let him proceed with it. I didn't look at her. I'd spent the last 3 months deciding not to look at her until I absolutely had to. The judge wasn't finished. Mr. Calloway, your counsel has submitted documentation showing that over the past 6 years, you transferred or gifted approximately $340,000 in financial support to your daughter and son-in-law. Is that accurate? Beverly nodded at me. Yes, Your Honor, I said. That includes a $195,000 contribution toward their home purchase in 2019, a $38,000 vehicle, and monthly transfers that averaged roughly $3,800 for the last 4 years. And after your stroke last October, you made the decision to reduce those monthly transfers significantly. Is that correct? I reduced them to 0, Your Honor. Yes. And this petition was filed approximately 6 weeks after that decision. 7 weeks, Beverly said quietly. The judge looked at Derek one more time, and whatever she saw there appeared to satisfy some internal conclusion she'd already reached. This petition is denied. The respondent has demonstrated more than adequate competency, both in these proceedings and in the records submitted to this court. Furthermore, I'm ordering the petitioners to reimburse Mr. Calloway's legal fees in the amount of $9,400, due within 45 days. She looked at Derek's lawyer. And I will be referring the matter of Dr. Harmon's report to the State Medical Board. We do not file fraudulent psychiatric evaluations in my courtroom without consequences. We're done here. The gavel came down. Beverly exhaled slowly beside me. That went about as well as it could have. I nodded. Across the aisle, Derek was already on his feet, his jaw tight, speaking in a low, controlled voice to his attorney. Diane sat perfectly still. When I finally let myself look at her, she wasn't looking at me. She was staring at the table in front of her with an expression I hadn't seen on her face since she was 9 years old and had broken her mother's favorite vase and knew she couldn't explain her way out of it. In the parking lot, Beverly walked me to the car. My neighbor and oldest friend, Frank Okafor, was waiting behind the wheel. He'd insisted on driving me that morning, and I'd been too tired to argue. Well? Frank asked as I climbed in. Dismissed, I said. Frank started the engine and allowed himself a single, quiet smile. Good. Beverly leaned through the window. The $9,400 clock starts today. I'll follow up in 30 days. If they haven't paid, we have collection options. She paused. Harold, go home and rest. You've been carrying this for 3 months. She was right. I'd been carrying it longer than that. My name is Harold Calloway. I'm 63 years old. I spent 31 years as a structural engineer, took early retirement at 60, and have lived quietly in Tempe, Arizona, since my wife, Ruth, passed away 4 years ago. Ruth and I had one child, Diane. We raised her well, or we thought we did. She was sharp and funny and stubborn in the ways we admired when she was young. She met Derek Dalton when she was 26. He was handsome and confident, and the kind of man who made a strong first impression that took years to fully examine. I want to say I saw warning signs early. The truth is, I didn't, or I didn't want to. After Ruth died, things shifted in ways I didn't understand at first. Diane called more often, came by more often, which I appreciated, genuinely. Grief is isolating, and having my daughter close was a comfort. But the calls, I started to notice, had a rhythm to them. There would be warmth, real warmth, followed eventually by a need, a request. Sometimes small, sometimes not. The house contribution started with a conversation about how expensive real estate had become and how hard it was for young couples to get started. Ruth and I had always planned to help Diane with a home purchase eventually. It felt like honoring something. I gave them $195,000, which covered their down payment and then some. I didn't ask for repayment. I didn't set conditions. I told myself that's what parents do. The monthly transfers started smaller, $1,200 to help with a rough patch when Derek's marketing firm lost a major client. Then $2,000 when Diane cut back her hours after their son, Noah, was born. Then $3,800 when Derek decided to restructure the business, and cash flow was tight temporarily. Temporarily lasted 4 years. I also gave them the Nissan Pathfinder when I bought a new truck. $38,000, 3 years old, practically new. Derek drove it like it had always been his. In total, I gave them $340,000 over 6 years. I'm not saying that to generate sympathy. I'm saying it because it matters for understanding what happened next. Last October, I had a stroke. It was minor, as strokes go. My right arm went numb during breakfast on a Tuesday morning. I recognized what it was immediately, called 911 myself, and was in the hospital within 20 minutes. The doctors caught it fast. I spent 4 days at Maricopa Medical Center, received excellent care, and was discharged with a prescription regimen, a referral to a neurologist, and instructions to reduce stress significantly. I called Diane from the hospital the first morning. She answered on the third ring. "Dad, what's wrong?" She sounded annoyed at being called early, which told me something. I explained what had happened. I could hear her processing it on the other end of the line. "Oh my God. Are you okay?" "I'm stable. They say it's mild. I'd love to see you, if you can come by." A pause. "Today's not great, Dad. Derek has a client dinner and I have Noah's soccer tournament this weekend. It's the one he's been training for all fall." Another pause. "Can Frank check on you?" Frank did check on me. Frank drove 40 minutes from his house in Mesa, sat with me for 3 hours, brought me a sandwich from the place I like on Mill Avenue, and stayed until I fell asleep. My daughter did not come. Not that day, not the following day, not before I was discharged. She called twice while I was in the hospital. Both times, she asked how I was feeling and then mentioned, each time, that the furnace at their house needed replacing, and the quote was $6,200. I was lying in a hospital bed with an IV in my arm, and my daughter called to tell me about her furnace. I paid for the furnace because I was still, at that point, the version of myself that said yes without thinking about it. But something settled in me during those 4 days in the hospital. Something quiet and clarifying. The way very still water shows you your own reflection clearly. I looked at what I'd built with my daughter over 6 years, and I saw it for what it actually was. I came home. I recovered. I started physical therapy and followed every instruction my doctors gave me, partly because I intended to live a long and healthy life, and partly because I understood now that I needed to be very clear-eyed about my own affairs going forward. 6 weeks after I was discharged, I called Beverly Torres. I had updated my estate documents, established a clear power of attorney with Beverly as my agent in any incapacity scenario, and drafted a letter to Diane and Derek explaining that the monthly transfers would stop effective immediately. I did not do this out of anger. I want to be clear about that. I did it because I finally understood what I had done wrong. I had spent 6 years conflating generosity with love. I had written checks instead of having hard conversations. I had made it easy for my daughter and her husband to stop growing, to stop straining, to stop doing the quiet, difficult work of building a life, because the work wasn't necessary when I was there to soften every edge. I had created this, not alone, but I had participated in it fully, and the stroke had been, in its brutal way, a correction. I owed Diane honesty more than I owed her money. I should have understood that years earlier. The letter arrived on a Friday. Derek called Saturday morning before 8 o'clock. Harold. He used my first name like a tool. We need to discuss this. What you're doing here affects Noah too. It affects our whole family's stability. I understand that, I said. That's part of why I should have addressed it sooner. You had a stroke 3 months ago. You're not thinking clearly. I'm thinking more clearly than I have in years. We're going to need to talk to someone about this. His voice had shifted into a register I'd heard him use in business negotiations. Controlled, slightly threatening. I'm not going to let you make decisions that hurt my family. I want to tell you I handled that call perfectly. I didn't. I said too little, which I've learned is still better than saying the wrong things. I told him we could speak through our lawyers if he wished. He hung up. What followed over the next 7 weeks, I didn't anticipate, even though Beverly had warned me it was possible. Derek found a physician, a doctor, Harmon out of Scottsdale, who produced a report suggesting I had moderate cognitive decline and diminished capacity to manage financial affairs. Derek filed for guardianship. The petition stated that I was no longer competent to handle my own estate, that my decision to cease financial support was evidence of impaired judgment, and that it was in my best interest for a court-appointed or family-designated guardian to oversee my finances. What it meant, translated into plain language, was that my son-in-law wanted a judge to hand him legal control over my money. I found out about the filing through Beverly, who had received notification as my attorney of record. I read through the documents alone in my kitchen on a Wednesday evening, a glass of water at my elbow, the ceiling fan turning slowly above me. I'd been building a cedar bookshelf in my garage workshop that week, a project I'd started to give my hands something to do during recovery. I thought about going back to the workshop, but sat with the documents instead. I called Frank. You okay? He asked, because Frank always knows what kind of question to ask. I will be, I said. I need to tell you what's happened. He came over. He sat across from me at the kitchen table and read through the petition. He's a retired high school principal. He has that quality that good teachers have, of being able to hold a difficult situation in his mind without flinching away from it. Well, he said, when he finished reading. Yeah, I said. What does Beverly say? She says we fight it. She says we win. Frank put the papers down. Then that's what you do. What I didn't mention to Frank that night, though he probably understood it anyway, was the part about Diane. Her name was on the petition, not as the primary filer. Derek had handled that, but she had signed the supporting documents. Her signature was on the page that described her father as potentially unable to make sound decisions. Her handwriting, the rounded, careful script I'd watched her develop as a child, on a court document arguing that I needed to be controlled. The weeks between the filing and the hearing were quiet, in a way that felt deliberate. No calls from Diane, no calls from Derek, just the occasional update from Beverly about procedural matters. I went to my neurologist appointments. I finished the cedar bookshelf. I had dinner with Frank twice a week at the kitchen table, and we talked about things that had nothing to do with any of this, which was its own form of medicine. My grandson, Noah, was 8 years old. He called me on a Thursday evening, 3 weeks before the hearing. His voice was small in the careful way that children's voices get when they're trying to sound like something isn't wrong. Grandpa, are you sick again? No, buddy. I'm doing fine. Why do you ask? Mom and Dad were talking about you. They said you weren't making good decisions and that they had to help you. I pressed my hand flat against the kitchen counter. Breathed. Grandpa, are they taking your house? 8 years old. He'd heard something, absorbed more than he should have, and now he was sitting in his bedroom worried about his grandfather's house. I thought about Derek, who had put that worry there. Nobody is taking anything, Noah, I promise. Are you doing okay? I'm okay. I miss coming over. Come over this weekend. We'll work in the workshop. I'm building something you can help me sand. Okay. A pause. Grandpa, are you and my mom in a fight? Your mom and I are working some things out. That's between us. It's not your job to fix it, and it's not anything you did. You understand? Yeah. Good. I love you. See you Saturday. He came Saturday. I didn't ask him anything about what was happening at home. We sanded 3 shelves together, and I showed him how to use the hand plane on a rough edge. He left with sawdust in his hair and a piece of scrap oak I'd let him carve his initials into. He asked to come back the following weekend. I said yes. That Sunday night, I sat in my workshop after he'd gone and thought about what this had cost him. This child who loved his grandfather and his mother equally and had done absolutely nothing wrong. It's one thing to let the adults in a situation suffer their own consequences. It's another when an 8-year-old ends up in the middle of it, confused and quiet, trying to understand things that shouldn't be his to understand. That was the part that I could not find peace with, no matter how right I knew my decision was. The hearing came and went the way I've already described. Dismissed. Fees awarded. Dr. Harmon referred to the medical board. Beverly shook my hand in the parking lot, and Frank drove me home. My phone started ringing before we reached the freeway. Derek, I declined. Derek again declined. Then, a text from an unknown number that I recognized as Diane's work phone. We need to talk about this. Today. I put the phone face down in my lap and watched the desert go by outside the window. The saguaros along the highway were the ones I'd driven past hundreds of times, in different states of mind, in different decades of my life. They looked exactly the same as they always had, which is the thing about a landscape that has outlasted everything you've gone through. You hungry? Frank asked. Not really. I'm making green chili stew tonight. You're coming over. I didn't argue. By the time I got home after dinner, I had 23 missed calls. 11 from Derek, 9 from Diane, 3 from a number I didn't recognize. I listened to 4 of the voicemails and deleted the rest. The early ones were controlled and demanded a conversation. The later ones from Derek were not controlled. He used language I won't repeat. He called me vindictive. He said I would regret forcing his family into this situation, as though the situation had been my engineering and not his. Diane's messages were harder to listen to. Not because they were threatening. She wasn't threatening, but because she sounded frightened. And I had loved her for 63 years, and there was still a part of me that reacted to her fear like a reflex. I had to sit with that feeling and not let it make my decisions for me. That's harder than people think. The weeks after the ruling unfolded the way Beverly had predicted. Derek and Diane hadn't paid the $9,400 in legal fees by the halfway mark of the 45-day window. Beverly wasn't surprised. Through the channels available to her, she'd learned that their finances had deteriorated sharply since I'd stopped the transfers. The mortgage payments on the house were 2 months behind. Derek's business had lost 2 more clients. Their credit card debt had climbed to somewhere near $22,000. They had built a life calibrated precisely to my generosity. When the generosity stopped, the calibration fell apart. Through Noah, who called me every week and whose calls I always took, I learned things in the way you learn things from children, without filter or framing. Dad's been home a lot more lately, Noah said one afternoon. He says he's working from home, but he just walks around a lot. How's your mom? She's sad, I think. She cries sometimes when she thinks I can't hear, but she still makes dinner and stuff. A pause. Grandpa, do you miss my mom? I looked out the window at the rosemary bush Ruth had planted along the front walk, which I'd maintained carefully for 4 years because maintaining it was one of the ways I kept my end of a conversation that no longer had a second voice. Yes, I said. I do. She misses you too. She doesn't say it, but I can tell. Noah, I want you to know something. None of this is your parents' fault entirely, and it's not just one person's fault. Sometimes grown-ups let things go wrong for a long time before they fix them. Your mom and I both let some things go wrong. Are you going to fix them? I hope so. That depends on some things I can't control. Okay. He thought about this. Can I still come over this weekend? Always. Derek came to the house one evening without warning. About 3 weeks after the ruling. I was in the garage workshop. Frank had gone home an hour earlier. I heard the truck in the driveway and came out to find Derek standing at the garage entrance, hands in his pockets, looking like a man who had practiced something and then forgotten it. He was thinner than the last time I'd seen him. The suit he was wearing was the right size, but he was not the right size for it anymore. I didn't invite him in. I leaned against the workbench and waited. "I need you to hear something," he said. "Go ahead." The petition was my idea, not Diane's. She signed the papers because I pressured her, told her it was the only way to protect the family. She didn't want to do it. He looked down at the concrete floor. "I told her you'd been acting strangely since the stroke. I made it sound more serious than it was. I wanted the money, and I convinced myself I was doing it for the right reasons, but I wasn't." I let the silence sit there. "I've done a lot of things wrong," he said. "I took your money and called it family support. I took the transfers and told myself you wanted to give them. I told myself you were happy to help." He rubbed the back of his neck. "I think I knew it wasn't right. I just stopped caring enough to fix it." "Why are you telling me this?" "Because Diane asked me to." He paused. "And because I'm losing everything, and I needed you to know it wasn't her. She's not me." I thought about Noah in his bedroom, hearing things through walls that an 8-year-old shouldn't hear. I thought about my daughter's handwriting on that court document. "Derek," I said, "I don't doubt that some of what you're saying is true. But Diane is not a child. She made choices. Signing those papers was one of them. You don't get to carry all of this so she comes out clean." He nodded. He'd expected that, I think. "I'm not going to restore the payments to either of you. That's finished." I kept my voice level. "If you work hard, live within what you actually earn, and take care of your son properly, you'll be fine. You're not old, and you're not incapable. You have just been living on someone else's work for too long." "I know. The $9,400 is still owed. I expect payment by the deadline." "I know that too." He left. I stood in the garage for a while after the sound of his truck faded down the street. Then I went back to the workbench. Diane called 3 days later. I answered. She didn't say anything immediately. Neither did I. We sat on the line together for almost 10 seconds, and I thought about how strange it is that two people can share 30 years of history and still not know how to begin a conversation. "Dad." Her voice was quiet. "Hi, sweetheart." She exhaled slowly. "I don't know where to start." "Wherever you need to." "I signed those papers." A pause. "I told myself I was protecting you, that your judgment had actually changed since the stroke. I almost convinced myself it was true." Her voice caught. "But I knew. I knew what Derek wanted, and I knew it wasn't about protecting you. And I signed them anyway." I sat down at the kitchen table. "When you were in the hospital last fall," she said, "I didn't come. I told myself Noah needed me, and Derek needed me, and you had Frank, and it would be fine." A longer pause. "But the truth is, I was afraid. If I sat in that hospital room with you, I had to think about losing you, and I didn't know how to do that. So I just didn't go." Her voice was steady now, but only just. "That's the worst thing I've ever done, and I've been living with it." I waited. "I'm not asking you to forgive me," she said. "I don't expect that. I just needed to tell you that I know what I did." Outside my kitchen window, the late afternoon sun was hitting the rosemary bush at the angle that turned it almost silver. Ruth had chosen it for that quality. She'd said she wanted something that looked different in different light. I'd thought about that a lot in 4 years. "I know why you didn't come," I said. "I'm not sure I understood it when it happened. I do now." Silence. "I made mistakes too," I said. "I gave you money when I should have given you harder conversations. I made it easy not to grow up, because it was easier than watching you struggle. That's on me." I paused. "I don't say that to excuse what happened. I say it because, if we're going to be honest, we have to be honest all the way. Derek told me what he said to you in the garage." "Yes. He's moving out. We're separating." She didn't sound relieved or devastated. She sounded like someone who had been expecting a storm and was now simply watching it arrive. "He's going back to his brother's place in Flagstaff. I think we both know the marriage has been over for longer than either of us admitted." "How's Noah?" "Confused, sad, but okay. He asks about you constantly." A pause. "He's a good kid, Dad. He got that from you and Mom, not from us. He got it from you too. Don't sell yourself short on that." She was quiet again. When she spoke, her voice was smaller. I don't know how to do this alone. You're not alone, I said. But things are going to be different. I'm not restoring any financial support for you or Derek. That's done. You need to learn to stand on your own, and I believe you can. You're capable of more than you've been asked to do for the last 6 years. I know. But Noah is not going to be collateral in this. His expenses, his school, anything he needs directly, I'll help with. Not through you, not through Derek. Directly for him. That's more than fair. She paused. More than I deserve. It's not about what you deserve. It's about him. We talked for another hour. Not about money, not about Derek, not about the petition, about Ruth. Because we hadn't really talked about her mother together in a long time, and it turned out we both needed that. About Noah, and what he was like in school, and what made him laugh. About a road trip Ruth and I had taken through Utah when Diane was 12, which she remembered differently than I did, and we went back and forth on the details until we were both laughing at something small and specific. When we hung up, I sat quietly in the kitchen for a while. Then I went out to the garage. The cedar bookshelf I'd finished was standing against the wall, completed, waiting to be stained. I'd been working alongside it on a second project, a window bench with storage underneath, made from reclaimed pine I'd found at the lumber salvage yard. I'd started it the week I filed for legal representation, which, looking back, was not a coincidence. I picked up the hand plane and went back to work on the bench's front panel. The wood was old and had its own opinions about being reshaped. There were knots and variations in the grain that required patience, adjusting the angle of approach, reading what the material was telling you and working with it rather than against it. Ruth used to watch me in the workshop and say that I was a different person in here than anywhere else, more quiet, more present. I'd asked her once what she meant. She'd said that outside the workshop I was always planning something, always 3 steps ahead. But in here I was only where I was. I thought she was right about that. A few weeks passed. Derek's name dropped off the missed call list. Beverly confirmed they'd received partial payment on the legal fees, $4,500, with a commitment on the remainder. It wasn't ideal, but Beverly said it showed good faith, and we had options if they defaulted. Diane got a job, a real one. She'd had a part-time bookkeeping arrangement she'd done from home for years, more to maintain her credentials than out of necessity. She reached out to a former employer and was hired full-time at a property management company. 41 hours a week. Health insurance. Direct deposit. The first time she mentioned her paycheck in conversation, she said it in a way I hadn't heard from her in years, like something that belonged to her. I didn't tell her I was proud of her right away. I waited. Pride too early can become a ceiling. I wanted her to live inside the accomplishment long enough for it to become part of her identity before I named it. I told her 3 weeks later, on a Sunday when she and Noah came for lunch. She looked at me for a moment like she wasn't sure she'd heard correctly. "I'm proud of you," I said again. She nodded once and looked away quickly, the way she'd looked away from things that mattered to her since she was a teenager. But her jaw was set in the way it gets when she's holding something together. Noah looked between us with the alert, watchful expression of a child who understood more than he said. Then he asked if we could work in the garage after lunch. I said yes. We spent 2 hours in the workshop that afternoon. Noah had developed a genuine interest in the joinery process, which pleased me more than I knew how to explain. He was careful and precise. He asked good questions. He had the patience for it, which is not a common thing in an 8-year-old. I showed him the window bench, nearly finished now. Explained how the reclaimed pine had required different treatment than new wood, how you had to account for what it had already been through. "Why didn't you just use new wood?" he asked. "Because this wood has more character," I said. "It's been through something. That makes it more interesting. But it also means you have to be more careful with it. You can't force it. You have to understand what you're working with." He thought about this for a moment, running his small fingers along the grain of the panel. "Is this kind of like people?" he asked. I looked at my grandson, this 8-year-old who'd spent months listening to adult conflict through walls and come out the other side still curious, still willing to spend Sunday afternoons learning how to use a hand plane. "Yeah, buddy," I said. "It's exactly like people." Diane came into the workshop doorway with coffee, leaned against the frame. The late afternoon light made her look, for just a moment, like a much younger version of herself. standing in our garage in the house she grew up in, watching her father work. Some things are not repairable. Derek and Diane's marriage was one of them. 6 years of bad choices, compounded, had a trajectory that couldn't be redirected. I wasn't going to pretend otherwise. But some things, with the right amount of patience and honesty and a willingness to account for what the material had already been through, could be rebuilt. Differently than before. Better boundaries, clearer expectations, relationships earned rather than assumed. The window bench was finished the following Saturday. I stained it a warm walnut, let it cure for 2 days, then carried it into the living room and set it under the front window. Sat on it to test the weight. Solid. Clean lines. The pine had knots that showed through the stain, visible history made into something useful. Frank came over that evening and stood looking at it for a long moment. "That's good work," he said. "It took longer than it should have. Things that are built right usually do." He accepted the glass of iced tea I handed him and sat in the armchair across from the bench. "You seem different." "Different how?" "Lighter," he considered. "Like you stopped carrying something." I sat on the new bench and thought about what I was still carrying and what I had set down. The anger, most of it, had gone. The grief, which had been there long before the stroke, was still present, but familiar now, more like weather than emergency. The wariness about Diane was not gone. It would take a long time, maybe years, maybe the rest of my life, to know if the change in her was real, or whether she would slip back into old patterns when things got hard again. I had accepted that uncertainty. What I had stopped carrying was the part of me that kept saying yes when yes was wrong. That part had been keeping me small in ways I hadn't fully understood until it was gone. "You know what Ruth used to say," I said. "She'd say I was a good engineer, but a terrible negotiator. That I always gave away more than I needed to in order to get an agreement." Frank smiled slowly. She wasn't wrong. No, she usually wasn't. I looked at the bench, at the knots in the pine showing through the walnut stain. I think she would have stopped me earlier. Told me to set the boundary before the 6 years and the $340,000 and all the rest of it. She probably would have. I had to learn it myself. I paused. Expensively. Most important lessons come that way. Outside the front window, the evening had settled into the specific blue that Arizona does in October. That deep, clear color that doesn't exist the same way anywhere else I've been. Noah was coming for dinner Thursday. Diane and I had a standing phone call on Sunday evenings now. Nothing elaborate, just check-ins. The beginning of a new language between us. It was fragile, and neither of us pretended otherwise. But it was ours. Built honestly, on actual ground. Sometimes that's the only foundation that holds. If this story meant something to you, please give it a like and share it with someone who might need to hear it. Leave a comment below about a time you had to make a hard choice to protect your own dignity. And if you want to hear the next story, it's right there in the box on your screen. I'll see you there.